Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Hello there. This episode of Reinventing Parking is a solo episode with me, Paul Barter. I'll be sharing with you the key points from a talk I gave last week in Berlin. The title was Parking Change for Better Public Space. Let's reduce parking-related harm to our urban public realm. I hope this might be useful for anyone working to improve public space in cities, especially if parking is turning up as an obstacle to the kind of improvements that you want. I presented it at a conference on urban public space organised by Agora Verkehrswende, which is a think tank in Germany that aims to promote a sustainable and climate-friendly transport system. The name of the think tank means Transport Transformation Forum, roughly translated. So many thanks to the team at Agora Verkehrswende for the opportunity. Let's get started. Here's a rough outline of my argument. I said that parking often harms the public realm and gets in the way of improvements to public space, and that it's essential to improve on-street parking management, especially if we are to do better. And so I gave a brief outline of the key essentials of on-street parking management. I then looked at how that can be made possible politically. Can managing parking better ever be popular? And I also mentioned walkable parking and the idea of park once and walk districts and how that's relevant to getting better public space. So, parking often harms the public realm and gets in the way of improvements, and parking policy weaknesses make this worse than necessary. So, of course, we all know that parking can take up a lot of public space, parking in the streets. In cities with very little street space, like Kathmandu, the parking dominates many of the streets. Even in German cities, parking can take up a lot of space in the streets and is allowed to take up a lot of the public realm. In many developing countries, India, Vietnam, Colombia, China, Indonesia, there's a lot of parking in the frontages in front of buildings, and it's often ambiguous whether that parking is in the public realm or in the private realm. It kind of straddles it, it blurs the boundary, and it very much harms the walking environment. The way parking is designed in the streets is often suboptimal and makes the public realm degraded to some extent. We can easily think of examples of this, parking that is allowed to take up just too much space, or parking that's allowed to straddle sidewalks for footpaths. But then parking management, even if the design is okay, parking management also can degrade the public space, because weaknesses in parking management lead to double parking, illegal parking on footpaths or on pavements, sidewalks. And we get a lot of nuisance parking as a result of weaknesses in parking management. Another link with the public realm is the impact of weaknesses in parking management on the wider picture. So weak parking management in the streets makes parking seem scarcer than it really is. It's an extremely common thing to find chaos in the streets and then very nearby to find empty off-street parking. If it's cheap and easy to park for free and even illegally in the streets, why would you seek out a off-street parking space where you would often have to pay and it's a little less convenient? So weak on-street parking management undermines off-street parking in various ways. People are less willing to seek it out. They're less willing to pay for off-street parking. So this undermines the feasibility of off-street parking as an investment, as a business. It also undermines entrepreneurship. It undermines the incentives that owners of off-street parking might have to make it open to the public or to manage it well. So this creates a shortage, or at least the sense of a shortage. It may create the impression of a shortage when there's not really a shortage, or it might undermine off-street parking investments to such an extent that there really is a shortage. This prompts governments to panic and compel developers to build parking off-street with minimum parking requirements, parking mandates, parking norms, or to build parking themselves, or to subsidise parking themselves with city-built parking facilities. But You might think off-street parking would be good for the public realm by taking parking off the streets, but it won't do that unless on-street parking is managed well to start with. But even if it is successful and you have plentiful off-street parking, excessive off-street parking can be too much of a good thing, and it harms the public realm as well. Excessive amounts of surface parking, as we see in many Midwestern North American cities, for example, do not make for a pleasant public realm. Even structured parking, a busy off-street parking garage with wide exits and entrance driveways, is to some extent a nuisance to the pedestrian realm in the street. These buildings often have blank walls unless they've been built with retail at ground level, and that also harms the public realm. Frontage parking, as we see, where there's parking directly between buildings and the street, often impeding the footway or causing numerous crossings of the footways, certainly are harmful to the public realm. Townhouses or medium-density housing, each with its own off-street, on-site parking, harms the public realm with the numerous driveways. Excessive off-street parking also harms the public realm indirectly by generating more and more traffic. It's a fertility drug for cars, as Donald Shoup has said. Excessive traffic, of course, is not conducive to a pleasant public realm. Getting back to on-street parking management and the weaknesses in on-street parking management, these weaknesses, for the various reasons that we've already seen, make us nervous about the idea of repurposing on-street parking. And repurposing on-street parking is one of the key opportunities for improving the public realm, of course. We can have parklets, we can repurpose some parking to be pedestrian space, we can repurpose parking to be safe bicycle facilities, and so on. But we're very likely to be anxious about the political backlash that might ensue whenever there's a proposal to repurpose any on-street parking. In cities where the on-street parking is not well managed, it will be seen as this hugely precious resource that couldn't possibly be redeployed to any other purpose. So we've seen how on-street parking management is crucial. Weak on-street parking management is a key reason parking harms the public realm in the various different ways I've already talked about. So improving on-street parking management is crucial to give us more opportunities to do less harm with parking in the streets. So now let me turn to the key essentials of on-street parking management. This will just be a brief section. In Berlin, I was talking to a general audience, and so I didn't go into much detail, but I did want to share the key basics as I see them. The first thing is I urged the audience to think differently about parking. So focusing on on-street parking, think of on-street parking as a commons, like the village grazing lands or fisheries or hunting grounds or the air that we might pollute. These are commons that will tend to be overused if they're not managed. So let's manage them. In the case of on-street parking, managing it means we need to design it well, we need to ration it, and we need to enforce. But street design comes first, so planning that public realm in the streets is the primary thing. Parking design is part of street design, so we should focus on the purposes of the street first. And we design the parking so that we get parking where we want it, the way we want it, the orientations, etc., and nowhere else. And all of that should be in keeping with the goals of that particular street. Different streets will have different mixes of purposes, whether it's traffic flows, being a place, a public space, providing access to the buildings nearby and the sites nearby. Ideally, our design will be clear enough that good parking behaviour will be very obvious. It'll be very obvious to motorists how they should park and where they should park. But of course, we need to back up this good parking design with effective enforcement. And that's a difficult thing for many cities. It varies around the world. I was quite interested while I was in Germany to find that actually German cities struggle with this for various reasons, which hopefully we can talk about in a future episode of Reinventing Parking. I'll interview someone from Germany and we can talk about some of the issues in German parking. Effective enforcement, what does that mean? consistent enforcement is much better than occasional enforcement. The occasional blitz really just doesn't help much. The penalties have to be sufficient to deter the wrong behaviour, but no more. The enforcement should be by the right agencies, and all of the ducks need to be lined up so that the agency has the right incentives to do what it needs to do and will have the funds. And there's huge opportunities arising in enforcement to do better. Technology is opening up new opportunities, and in particular enforcement that captures license plates and integrates well with payment technologies. So I mentioned rationing earlier. The key elements of on-street parking management: design, enforcement, and rationing. When we're into the issue of rationing, the most powerful and efficient way to do that is to use pricing. Wherever the parking demand is high enough, you'll probably need to resort to pricing. And it works. We know it works. By the way, effective pricing also eases your problems with enforcement because there's less temptation to park illegally if the parking is not full all the time. So in summary, there's these three key goals in on-street parking management: clear and ideally self-enforcing design to serve the street's roles, enforcement against nuisance parking, and pricing to achieve some vacant spaces and to make sure the parking is not full. I've argued that on-street parking management is crucial to open up opportunities for better public space, and I've briefly run through the key basics, the foundations of good on-street parking management. But many cities and many administrations are nervous about improving their on-street parking management because of the unpopularity, especially of enforcement and of the rationing, especially the pricing. So can we reduce the unpopularity of parking management to the point that we can enable more public realm improvements? In Berlin, in my talk, I ran through some ideas I shared with the audience, trying to encourage them that the answer is yes, you can. Reduce the unpopularity. Don't dream of having popular parking management. That's too much to hope for. But let's get parking management not so unpopular. Really send the message that our focus is behaviour change, not something else, and especially not revenue. There will be some revenue, but we need to send the message that the revenue is not the reason we're doing this. The reason we're doing this is to change the behaviour, to get the parking behaviour the way we want it, good enough at least, so that we can achieve all of the other things we want to achieve in our streets. People hate the sense that they're being tricked. So the slide I used in Berlin had a picture of a very confusing parking sign from Washington, D.C., and that just is asking for trouble. Donald Shoup has some interesting ideas of targeting habitual violators. Someone who just makes the occasional mistake could just get a warning if it's something that didn't endanger anyone. As I said before, parking enforcement that is steady and consistent is more effective than the occasional blitz, but it's also much more popular. An occasional blitz is very unpopular because you fail to enforce for maybe months and then suddenly you give everyone tickets. They feel cheated. Some cities have experimented with changing the job descriptions of the wardens and making a much more positive job description, emphasising helping people to do the right thing, much more than penalising them when they do the wrong thing. So let's turn to pricing. Again, we need to send a very strong signal that it's parking management that we're trying to achieve here. In Berlin, in my talk, I highlighted that there's a growing trend for demand-based parking prices that vary from place to place and also often from time to time, so that you get the lowest possible price to achieve what you're trying to achieve, which is a few empty spaces, so that newcomers can always arrive and find a place to park. I highlighted that actually, surprise, demand-based parking pricing eases the unpopularity of parking fees. So how is that? You aim for the lowest price that hits the target of achieving a few vacancies. So you promise we're not going to charge you any more than we absolutely have to achieve what we're trying to achieve. It's purely data-based, based on objective evaluations of that data. And technology comes in there to help us collect that data more efficiently. So all of this helps allay retailer fears, for example. The retailers, typically when pricing is introduced, they fear that the price will be too high and that the parking will be too empty for too long and visitors will be deterred and they'll lose customers. This approach reassures them that if that was to happen, the prices would quickly be dropped back to the lowest necessary. To allay some of the objections from motorists, we can promise that there'll be cheaper parking nearby, so to pay less, walk a bit. You can also pay less by visiting off-peak, especially if there are different prices at different times of the day. To ease the challenge for elected officials currently in many cities are in the awkward position of having to vote on price increases or price adjustments for parking. In this approach, every so often, maybe once every 5 years, they will be asked to vote on the principle. This depoliticizes the individual, regular, small but regular price changes and enables the politicians to feel braver to put in place the right prices at the right times. It was something of a surprise, say, for San Francisco or Seattle or Calgary, some of the cities that have done this, that after an initial fuss with people being unfamiliar with this idea, the controversy about the demand-based pricing very quickly dies off. But extending parking pricing to new places that didn't have pricing before is always really tough. Here are some suggestions for how that might be eased a little bit. Not only should we use data to drive the choice of what price the parking should be, but we can use data to drive the choice of whether to initiate pricing or not. So there should be a trigger based on objective evaluation of the conditions. That's a data-driven approach. So that helps depoliticize the choice. It eases people's fears that, again, this is just a tax grab or a revenue grab. If a city really is serious about proving to the citizens and the community that this parking pricing is all about parking management and not about revenue, one way to prove that is to give back a lot of the revenue to the local community in one way or another. One of the keys to making parking management less unpopular is to get very visible and tangible results. Now let me turn to off-street parking again, because there's a connection between our whole approach to off-street parking and better public space. So remember earlier I talked about off-street parking and how in various ways off-street parking can be harmful to public space. One approach that I've been urging in my writings at Reinventing Parking and when I speak is the idea of walkable parking. This touches on Nelson Nygaard and people like Jeffrey Tumlin and Patrick Siegman who talk about park once and walk parking planning. Okay, so walkable parking idea is essentially this idea that we should plan districts as park once and walk areas. I want to argue that this is a crucial way to smooth the path for better public space as well. So how is that? Well, we've seen that better on-street parking management eases some of the fear of repurposing parking, but there's a bit more to this fear of repurposing parking. Of course, in the conventional approach to off-street parking, most parking ends up being private parking on-site within every destination, for example, within every retail outlet or every workplace, every school, etc. When that's the case and there's very little public parking that is open to the public, any shortage at any one of those sites becomes a problem because then there'll be the worry about spillover into neighbouring parking or into the little public parking that we have, which is very, very often just the on-street parking. Conversely, if you have a park once and walk district where most parking, or at least a large fraction of the parking, is part of a pool of parking for the whole area, the public parking for the whole area, that means it's walkable parking in that area. So a first reason this eases pressure on the public space is that you actually just need less parking in that situation. Parking that is open to the public and therefore shared between different land uses in a mixed-use park once district is much more efficiently used. The peak times for parking are different for the different land uses, and so the overall pool of parking needs to be less plentiful than if you needed enough for every single site. But in addition, this promotes walkability, which is good for the public realm. If most parking is public and priced, then that encourages walking. Public parking promotes walking, which promotes street-oriented businesses. This is best with mixed land use, which also helps walkability and the resilience of the parking in the area. And finally, here's another argument. An area-wide pool of public parking in a park once and walk district, a walkable parking area, actually eases the fear of a localized shortage. I mentioned it eases fears of shortages on individual sites, individual buildings, but it also just more generally eases the fear of shortage. And so that also eases our fears about repurposing some of the parking. Maybe some of the on-street parking might be needed for, a bus lane or a tram lane or a bicycle lane, etc. This all depends on good on-street parking management. So this is not instead of good on-street parking management, it's in addition to good on-street parking management. There was a great example of this earlier this year, the ongoing King Street pilot in Toronto. It's a transit priority experiment in King Street, a really busy tram-based corridor in Toronto. So in the controversy over this King Street pilot, the owners of several restaurants in so-called Restaurant Row objected to losing parking in front of their shops and in the street nearby. So on Twitter, Gil Meslin, a planner from Toronto, used maps to highlight, number one, the huge number of residences and jobs within a short walk of these restaurants. So these are all potential customers who can reach the restaurants without ever setting foot in a vehicle. But secondly, he also highlighted the huge number of public parking spaces within easy walking distance in a series of tweets. And so this highlights the idea of thinking about parking in a walkable parking area. The loss of a few specific parking spaces is put in a much wider context, and it's never quite the crisis that people think it is if they're focused on narrowly on just the parking in the street. So in conclusion, I ended by saying let's aim for such good parking management and such excellent park once and walk district planning that no one will perceive any kind of shortage. The streets will be orderly. No one will feel that parking is in short supply. And so there's no pressure for more supply. And so we won't get the evils of excessive off-street parking and the harm that does to the public realm. It'll also ease the fears about repurposing parking spaces. So there'll be no fuss. It'll just work. And then we can set about the job of improving our public spaces. So I hope you found this useful and provided you with a few arguments for why reducing parking-related harm to our urban public realm is possible, and that parking change is important to help us get better public space. You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.